Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today and taking the time out of your busy schedules to listen to me today. I hope what I share here today is valuable to you and you'll take it with you back to your communities and share it with all of your loved ones because it's definitely something that needs to be shared and isn't really talked about enough. So, my name is Russell McCauley. I identify as Two Spirit, Cree and Métis from Cumberland House Cree Nation, which is situated on Treaty 5 territory. I use he and she pronouns, and today I'm actually coming to you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is located on Treaty 6 territory. So in saying this, I'd like to acknowledge that we're all gathered here today on my land, the traditional land of the Métis people, and I'd like to pay my respects to the specific First Nations people of this territory, which include the Nehawa, the Nakawi, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Dene, and Métis ancestors of this land. I always find it weird to do land acknowledgements as an Indigenous person, simply because that's all I really want to say is that, we're gathered here on my land, and there's a large conversation behind that answer and that conversation, which I invite you to have with your friends and loved ones, your colleagues, wherever you occupy space and do land acknowledgements. I'd like you to talk about the history behind that action and why it's become relevant, and more importantly, why it might be becoming tokenized. What else can we do to expand the conversation so that we can have more equitable outcomes for all walks of life? So to begin, we're actually going to watch a short video. And the topic I'm asking right now is, what is race? Well, let's look at that.
You may think you know exactly what race you are, but how would you prove it if someone disagreed with you? The fact is, even though race drives a lot of social and political outcomes, race isn't real. One of the first people to attempt to categorize humans according to race was a German scientist around 1776. He came up with 5 different groups according to physical appearance and geographic origin of their ancestors. Americans of European descent eagerly bought into this type of thinking around the same time. Some historians have said the idea that there were different races helped them resolve the contradiction between a natural right to freedom and the fact of slavery. If whites were their own distinct category, then they could feel a lot better about denying freedom to people who they labeled Black and decided were fundamentally different. But as political priorities change, definitions of race in America adjust right along with them. For example, if you were of Mexican birth or ancestry in the United States in 1929, you were considered white. Then the 1930 census changed that to non-white to limit immigration. Later, when the U.S. needed to increase its labor force during World War II, these people were switched back to white. And what it took to be Black once varied so wildly throughout the country, from 1/4 to 1/16 to the infamous 1 drop of African ancestry, that people could actually change races just by crossing state lines. Then suddenly in 2000, the government decided that Americans could be more than one race and added a multiracial category to the census. This has left many Americans scratching their heads when it comes to selecting who they are. As many as 6.2% of census respondents selected some other race in a 2010 survey. The idea that someone might look one way and identify another way, or that they might be really hard to place in a racial category, is not new. This is why there was a public debate about whether MSNBC's Karen Finney could say she was Black, or how we can't even agree on the racial label assigned to the President of the United States. Of course, many people feel their racial identity is very clear and very permanent. But the fact that some people have changed theirs and that no one can really argue with them shows how shaky the very idea of race is. This is all because there isn't a race chromosome in our DNA that people can point to. It simply doesn't exist. When the medical community links race to health outcomes, it's really just using race as a substitute for other factors, such as where your ancestors came from, or the experiences of people who may have been put in the same racial group as you. Dorothy Roberts explains that sickle cell anemia is a prime example of this. The disease is linked to areas with high rates of malaria, which include some parts of Europe and Asia in addition to Africa. It's not actually about race at all. This, of course, does not mean that the concept of race isn't hugely important in our lives. The racial categories to which we're assigned can determine real-life experiences, they can drive political outcomes, and they can even make the difference between life and death. But understanding that racial categories are made up can give us an important perspective on where racism came from in the first place.
So I guess the biggest takeaway I would like each of you to, I want to resonate with you is that race is a socially constructed idea made to categorize us, separate us, and other functions that you've seen from the video. The video is actually quite dated. Obviously, our president has changed twice since this video, but I think it's still relevant to our discussion today, which is why I wanted to use it. But if anyone has a more up-to-date reference, I would love to see that. Now we're going to get into what is anti-racism. And I have a few descriptors here. Again, this is not going to do it justice. It's such a huge body of scholarly work, but I'll do my best. So when I first think about anti-racist education, I guess from a practitioner's perspective is that we see it as a method of analysis and a transformative pedagogy that addresses systemically the discourses, practices, and policies that reproduce racial inequities. And when I talk about racial inequities, I mean outcomes. And we're going to talk about those outcomes later in this course. So stay tuned for that. Also, when I think of anti-racist education, I think about understanding diversity as an effect of equity, not the other way around. And I have a really good quote that I'm going to use just shortly here that'll demonstrate this idea. And it's also an ongoing and sustained analysis of power, privilege, and oppression. And those are three enormous elements that we need to address in anti-racist education. Without them, we kind of fail at addressing the reality of what the dominant culture or the idea of, or the study of whiteness and how it is perpetuated in all forms of, in all structures of our society. And we're going to get into that as we go on. Anti-racist education is transformative rather than informative based. So think of it as a lifelong process. You might have heard of the term decolonization. Essentially, you're relearning everything you've been taught up until now. And it's a huge undertaking, but it's absolutely important if your organization, institution, business, whatever space you occupy or spaces you occupy, it's absolutely vital to be acknowledged that this is, it's not a one-off. You can't just take this course, this short workshop that we're gathered here for today, and it makes you an ally or an anti-racist person. It doesn't work that way. It's something that we each and every one of us have to work at. It also, anti-racist education also eliminates deflecting strategies that are used all over the world. And one example is color blindness as a policy approach. And what color blindness is essentially that as an individual, if I am using this approach, I don't see color, I just see people. And that's quite dangerous. I know it sounds like you're benefiting both parties, yourself and the colored person. But the reality is, if you don't see that person as a colored individual, you don't see the inequities that that person faces each and every day. So it's important that we move aside from this color blindness approach because it doesn't help anyone except maybe the dominant culture. And that's what we're going to talk about today, moving away from that. It also distances racism. That's another form of deflecting strategy, is that we distance racism to other parts of the world without looking at our own backyards. Anti-racist education shifts the critical attention from understanding the other culture to analyzing the mainstream culture and how it is reproduced. So when I say mainstream or the dominant culture, I'm directly referring to whiteness. And when I say whiteness, it's important to understand that I don't mean white people with white skin. I mean whiteness as an overall narrative, a body of study that I employ each and every one of you to research. That's one of the terms that we're going to talk about briefly. Also, anti-racist education encourages white and racialized settlers who benefit from whiteness to become allies in a genuinely responsible and accountable way. And what this looks like, there are many, many different examples, and I think we're going to talk about them as we move on in the short time frame that I have with you. So I'll continue for now. Anti-racist education, it uses racial equity indicators to determine progress of programs and policies. And this is when I start talking about the outcomes. And I think we need to start talking about those so I can give you a better demonstration and illustrate these inequities, because they're quite subtle for people who don't study race relations or don't study society in general. And that's when you start to think of the narrative that, oh, the system is broken, we need to do better. But the reality is the system is not broken. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to maintain and perpetuate whiteness. And we're going to talk about that. This is just a small visual that I gathered from many of my femtors. And this just shows the intersectionality of our identity. You know, we each have a different race, different gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, color, family status, religion, so on and so forth. So it becomes quite complex to identify where we situate ourselves within many spaces. And this just gives you a demonstration of that. Another great visual that I received from my femtors was this, kind of referred to as the onion of different forms of racism. So you could see right on the outer edge, here is structural racism, then we get into cultural racism, institutional racism, interpersonal racism, and internalized racism. And this could be hard to navigate, especially if you're outside the BIPOC community members, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color. It could be hard to identify what this might look like. So again, coming from my own perspective as a Cree Métis individual, I'd like to share how I navigate these systems as a way of demonstrating to you the different forms of racism and how they affect me personally. And of course, everyone will have different experiences with this, but today I'd like to offer my own. So I'll start in the center out, if that's okay. So here in the center, you see internalized racism is both the root and result of other forms of racism. When I suffered internalized racism as a young person, I remember leaving my reservation of Cumberland House Cree Nation and going into town, and I was, othered in those spaces. Where I come from, my mother's a teacher, my dad's a firefighter. So there's not a whole lot of jobs or resources or amenities. There's not a whole lot of anything really. I think I mentioned Cumberland House is the oldest settlement in Saskatchewan. And unfortunately, not much has changed since then. And in one of those ways, poverty runs really high in my community because of the lack of infrastructure, because of the lack of resources. There's not a whole lot of businesses out there that can employ people. So poverty runs quite high. And as a result, poverty is connected. Just like that intersectionality visual we seen earlier, poverty is connected to so many different inequitable outcomes for Indigenous people, such as poor mental health, addiction, and so many others that we're going to talk about. But again, I'm starting to ramble. I want to just give you a quick demonstration of how I navigate, or how I've come to navigate, whether intentional or unintentional, the different systems of racism. So again, beginning with internalized racism, I began to other myself when I left the community. I seen how different people treat me, because within my community, my parents were, they were employed, educated. So I guess you could say I was, in that instance, I was almost part of the dominant society. But when I left my reservation and went to town, our surrounding communities, different urban areas like Saskatoon, I was very much treated differently. I remember one time I was asked to leave a store because I shouldn't be in there, because I was most likely up to no good, I think was the language used. And my dad, who was white presenting, came up to the shopkeeper and said, "Hey, this is my son. He's with me." And the shopkeeper just looked like, startled, because my dad is white presenting and I obviously have a browner complexion. I'm brown. And I began to internalize that because you begin to hear people talk about Indigenous people. All these negative stigmas and stereotypes were all over mass media, within my community and surrounding communities. It was in my home. There were so many different instances or microaggressions that were built up that developed internalized racism. And I started to hear these things amongst my peers and my family members, my community, and that's where we get into interpersonal racism. It was so normalized to other different individuals, not only obviously between race, but also as an extension, a part of that intersectionality. There's also an extension to class, sexuality, all these different makeups that develop our social location and where we're situated in our social location and part of the greater society. Um, that definitely aided in the interpersonal racism that I experienced, and where a lot of these people that were, you know, I guess a part of my internalized racism came from institutional racism, because a lot of our community members and others learn this behavior within, for example, the school system, which is my example I'm going to use for institutional racism. Here in Saskatchewan, we have a curriculum that it's supposed to be a guide. It includes a lot of the different lesson plans and unit plans that we're supposed to utilize as a guide. And it dictates what we can and can't teach for all intentional purposes. And there's not a whole lot of makeup of Indigenous history and cultures. For example, we'd only just recently started teaching about the Indian residential school experiences as part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action. So growing up, a lot of the racism I experienced was due to institutional racism, where people learn this behavior. And I only use the education system as an example, but there are many others that we'll talk about in a moment. And as extension, there was also cultural racism. You know, the teachers, principals, school administrators, even parents of different students, the students themselves. It was culturally acceptable to push Indigenous history under the rug, so to speak, and not talk about those things. And it was so socially acceptable to consider Indigenous people as poor, drug addicts, you know, people that were violent, aggressive, no one that you wanted to associate with. And, you know, that was like really taken on in the greater society. And this all was rooted from structural racism. And you could see the bubble here indicates structural racism overarches all forms of racism and informs attitudes and assumptions. And there's two big examples of structural racism that I'd like to present. The first, obviously, is the Indian Act. You've heard of this. It's a very racist um, thing that exists within our legal systems and its structures. It really does dictate everything about Indigenous people, from what we call ourselves, where we live, how we navigate the world on our own land, which is completely detrimental to our well-being. And it still exists today, and we really do need to do away with that. The other example of structural racism is even older. And this is when we talk about papal laws or church laws, specifically the doctrine of discovery, which is a really old legal system that still demonstrates that I, as an Indigenous person, am a savage. And I can't believe we have Indigenous lawyers and judges and, you know, people working within the justice system, the legal system, that have to refer to this really racist, you know, palpable law. It's just awful. So you could see how the little onion, if you will, the little visual here that I've shown you that talks about the different forms of racism and the different layers to this onion. You could see how it affected someone like me, who again is two-spirit. You know, I was subject to a lot of different really harmful gender roles. I didn't learn my own language. When I went to school, I didn't learn about people like me. I learned about the dominant culture. You know, like the French Revolution. I didn't hear about Chief Poundmaker until I actually attended university. And that really did change the way I looked at myself and entered society. You know, how I operate myself, my values, morals, customs, traditions were all changed as a result of this system, as a result of racism. And I'm sure many people have different stories. That was just my short example. So, why today am I talking about anti-Indigenous racism? Isn't there all forms of racism? Why do I focus on Indigenous racism? Well, I was asked to talk specifically about rural Saskatchewan. And as an Indigenous person in the prairies, it's vital to talk about anti-Indigenous racism because it really is the most prevalent form of institutionalized racism here in the prairies. And this conversation, this introduction to anti-racist education might look different if we were in, say, BC or even Toronto. Sorry, I meant to say Vancouver or even Toronto. Those areas, very big urban centers. Especially now with the pandemic, I think I would be coming to you more from a lens of anti-Asian racism, which is really prevalent in those areas. Or even in the US, if I was in the US doing this presentation, I might talk about anti-Black racism, which is, again, very highly prevalent in many parts in the US. But today we're talking about rural Saskatchewan, which is why we're going to focus on anti-Indigenous racism because of the high prevalency rate here. So outcomes of Indigenous peoples are consistently different from non-Indigenous peoples in terms of health, justice, education, social services, even the very economy, and many other examples. So I mentioned the education system. I gave an example of how the Saskatchewan curriculum is really not made up of to include authentic Indigenous relations within the curriculum. It has gotten a lot better, I must say. And especially for me as a brand new teacher, I've learned the history of Indigenous education within our school systems and beyond. I can say, though, from my research that it certainly has not benefited the BIPOC community, certainly not Indigenous people, and has for sure demonstrated whiteness as a popular narrative, as the only narrative, really. Settler colonial myth that continuously presents Indigenous peoples as a problem that must be corrected. That is why we focus on anti-Indigenous racism today. Too often we're bombarded with the idea of meritocracy, that if you work hard, you can get anything you want in this life. But we, as BIPOC community members, anti-racist practitioners, and educated people in general, actually, no, I shouldn't say educated people in general, because I know quite a few educated people who don't know this narrative. But I certainly know that this myth, this narrative that Indigenous people are the problem that must be corrected, it's perpetuated all over in different structures of government and many different systems. And we need to do away with this idea of, like, specifically meritocracy, because we know that there are certain barriers that we as Indigenous people face that we can't overcome, and that's, keeping us from being successful in different spaces. This narrative that blames the poor outcomes on Indigenous peoples themselves, these include, like, that we're inferior, that we lack moral intelligence or skills, that we make bad life choices, or that we're lazy, etc. There are many different examples. It's not that those stories are untrue, it's that they're not complete. And that's specifically coming from the danger of a single story, which I employ each and every one of you to watch at your leisure. It's amazing, but I'll have to move on given the time constraints. So the outcomes that we're talking about, when I talk about Indigenous people specifically, links to poverty, food insecurities, and if you have food insecurities, you're not being able to feed yourself or your family, or you have access to poor nourished foods like, macaroni compared to an organic salad. If you're an assistant, which are you going to buy? So these are important conversations to have when you look at instances of inequities. There's also housing insecurities, and I mean specifically the issue of homelessness, dilapidated housing, especially in First Nations communities, or those who leave their Indian reservations and come to urban settings. They're faced with a lot of discrimination and renting and real estate. You've heard the idea of, or the study of redlining, very much exists here as well. And I don't think it's as prevalent as it was, say, 10 years ago, but I remember seeing ads that, said Indians or natives need not apply on their rental advertisements. It's just awful. Also, we look at instances of environmental racism, and then we look at intergenerational trauma of such incidents, for example, as the residential school experience. It's a common narrative that we need to just get over that, but how can we get over it if it's still happening today? Specifically, I look at the social welfare system, the child apprehension. There are more Indigenous children in care today that have ever went to residential school. So yes, we might have done away with the residential school, but it's certainly alive and well in other systems today, and we really need to address those. I mentioned child apprehension, over-incarceration rates of Indigenous people in prisons and jails. Still very high numbers of Indigenous people in the jail, in the prison systems, and it's awful when you look at the background of those individuals. And these are the barriers that we're talking about again. And then we could talk about culturally unsafe practices, cuts on social and community programming. So this is just a few examples of the inequities Indigenous people face. I could go on and on, but again, I don't have much time here. But I did want to point out some terms that I think are very, very important to your understanding of anti-racism, which provides a language to name and address power dynamics rooted in racial hierarchies. These terms develop your understanding, and this is a list of them there. I mentioned whiteness already. White fragility is another really important concept that white settlers really have to understand. And not only just white settlers, all walks of life should understand this if you're undertaking the journey of anti-racist education. Also internalized racism or colorism, performative allyship, tone policing, white savior complex, movements to innocence, and the deflecting strategies, which I kind of mentioned a couple of them today. So those are terms I'd like each and every one of you to look up if you're going to, expand your understanding. But another important concepts are to understand barriers of equity. How can we address these inequities that Indigenous people are facing? What are the barriers of equity that they're facing? Well, a few examples here are colonial and hierarchical structures that still exist today, resistance to change. There's, fragility to talk about oppression and privileges, and tone policing. These are two major examples of how we can't get past these inequities that Indigenous people are facing, because when we bring up the concept of racism or even residential schooling, people get really uncomfortable. But to address that, or I guess my answer to that would be think of how difficult it is as an Indigenous person coming to you today to talk about racism. It means something different when a white settler does this work. And I'm actually really of the belief that Indigenous people should not be teaching anti-racist education. It's really not our job. But I do it because there's not enough people doing it. I really do believe that anti-racist education should come from white settlers, because it really is a white settler issue. It's not an Indigenous person issue, for example. So that's why I say that. But I'll move on. There's also the discourse of individualism and meritocracy. Again, the idea that if you work hard, you can get anything you want in life. And we know that there are barriers for Indigenous people that just make this impossible. And Sheila McLean does a really good article on meritocracy that if you haven't already read it, please go out and read it. It's amazing. Also, we talked about the color blindness approach. It's really important to see color, because then you'll understand the inequities that colored individuals face. It's absolutely detrimental to have this approach of color blindness, because it really doesn't get to the root of the issue. This is the quote that I mentioned earlier that's really, really important. Focus on diversity and inclusion without centering equity equals tokenism. But equity outcomes as the focus equals diversity and inclusion. Think of that. That's very, very important. I hope I've done a good demonstration today, a good introduction to anti-racist education. And again, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to reach out to me. And I look forward to crossing paths with each and every one of you in the future. Stay safe, and I hope all is well. Thank you so much.